In today's video, we're talking legend versus challenger, boxy versus boxy. On this side, we have the new Toyota Land Cruiser, and on this side, we have a very dirty Ineos Grenadier. This has now been with us for 14 months, and I still like the Grenadier a lot. I also like the Land Cruiser a great deal because they both speak to me and where I live. I'm actually filming this in my yard, and this is the kind of road surface my vehicles have to drive on every single day. So whether we're talking about a Land Cruiser and it's more on-road focus, or a Grenadier and it's more off-road focus, they both look pretty good to me. And part of that's also because of the styling. They may both be boxy, but there are substantial differences, of course, between the Land Cruiser and the Grenadier. And we should talk about how either of these came to be. This is the mid-size Land Cruiser internationally. Around the world, there are 3 different Land Cruisers sold: the Land Cruiser 70, the 250, and the Land Cruiser 300. The Land Cruiser 300 in the US is known as the Lexus LX. That's the one that we get. But this format, we actually get 2. We get the Lexus GX and the Land Cruiser, minus the 250 or the Prado title. On this side, we have the Ineos Grenadier. If I squeak through here, this is basically old Defender modernized. It's not exactly a resto mod. It's a brand new vehicle that was designed to really mimic what people loved about the old Defender. And it's a pretty true copy because it drives kind of like an old car, especially compared to a brand new Land Cruiser. But before we get to how they drive, and trust me, we will get there, let's just take a look around and talk about the design. This is the Land Cruiser Land Cruiser. No, I'm not duplicating myself. That's actually the name of this model. Land Cruiser is the name of the vehicle and the name of this specific trim. If you were to get a 1958 Land Cruiser, then it would actually look a little bit more like the Grenadier over here because it would have circular headlights, and that is definitely my favorite look. I love the bold, square, boxy thing that Toyota has going on here, but you'll notice they did give it some pretty aggressive fender flares front and rear. Now, in contrast, the Grenadier is very traditional with a little bit of modern flair. We have full LED headlights, of course, with that angel ring around them, the Grenadier logo inside. And again, I apologize for this being really dirty. This gives you a little bit of a window into what it's really like living out here in the country, because I live on a gravel road. I drive on a gravel driveway, right like that gravel driveway right there, every single day. And last night and this morning it rained. Tomorrow it's going to rain again. So things just get really dirty. Now back to the Grenadier here. You can see it has much more of a traditional pronounced bumper on the front there, but it also has factory auxiliary lights. That's these guys in the center. So those can be turned on if you're in the on-road mode, high beams and low beams over there. Then it has sort of a Citroen-like V going on up front and a little bit of G-Wagon going on with that hood line there. Ineos was really interested in making this a very practical, sort of rugged heavy-duty vehicle. That's why we have things like the diamond plate on the front quarter panels, or on the front fenders rather. Those are actually load-bearing, so you can actually climb up on them and stand on the hood if you want to. Well, not the hood, but those panels. We don't find something similar over here in the Land Cruiser. Instead, this is much more of a modern vehicle design. This Grenadier has steelies on it, but of course you can get alloy wheels as well. We have the rock rails, rock sliders right there, and the utility belt side option. That's this little pattern going on the doors. You can actually latch things into there and carry shovels or mount whatever you want to the side of the vehicle. That's a really handy touch, and it uses the same attachment mechanisms that you find in the cargo area. Up here we have some power ports and tie-down ports. These are part of the auxiliary switch package, which is definitely kind of cool. A little ladder on the back and a double door style opening. So it's kind of a barn door rear with a little mini door on one side and then a bigger door on the other side. Spare tire, that's of course classically mounted on the rear. We have LED taillights that definitely have a resto mod kind of theme to them. Those look a little bit more aftermarket than original. Now if we go over here to the Land Cruiser, it's the same story as the front. Much more of a modern design, but logically still very boxy, just as customers seem to want. We find roof rails on this model, but none of those same kind of tie downs or any accessories. This one has the optional two-tone paint scheme. You can only get that in the Land Cruiser. If you get the 1958, it's monochrome only, and the color palette is more limited. We have full LED taillights, again, more of a modern design in the back, and a practical touch with hatch glass that opens separately from the hatch. So that way your stuff is not rolling around here. If you try and open the hatch, it's not going to fall on the ground. It's really handy for grocery shopping. And we have a rear windshield wiper that's mounted right in the middle of everything, logically where you'd want it to be. Of course, we have a traditional hatch back there. Back here, we have the hitch receiver. If you didn't have the hitch on there, you could put the hitch cover on the back. Here's what that looks like. It's this enormous and really protruding plastic thing. It kind of looks like a huge cod piece on the back of the bumper. It's a very odd little cover, I have to admit. This has a 4-pin and a 7-pin wiring harness connection. It can tow 6,000 pounds, and it has an integrated trailer brake controller. Something that is definitely missing over here in the Grenadier. Now, since I talked about that rear windshield wiper, I should show you this rear windshield wiper because it's a lot less useful. It's just on one window, and as you can see, it's wiping actually mostly what is covered by this tire. So you can see the wipe mark, it kind of wipes up to there, but a large portion of the area that wiper covers and clears actually just lets you see the tire from the inside. On the wheel and tire front, we have 20-inch alloy wheels on this model. We have 265/50 R20s, and these are a Dunlop Grand Trek. On the Grenadier, we have a Bridgestone Dueler all-terrain tire. Not the most rugged all-terrain tire, but a little bit better than the average all-season tire. 265/70 R17. So significantly smaller wheels. We have smaller brakes here as well. Keep that part in mind for later. And then we have more cushion as far as the tire goes. This may surprise some of you, it certainly surprised me, but these two vehicles are actually quite similar dimensionally. Well, some of the dimensions at least. The Land Cruiser is actually the longer model here. It's over 193 inches long, actually nearly 194 inches long, making it about 2.5 inches longer than the Grenadier. And remember, the Grenadier has that spare tire hanging off the back. But the Grenadier is the one with the longer wheelbase, 115 inches versus 112.2 over there. They're about the same width. Yet again, the lead goes to the Land Cruiser, and that's probably because of these wide fender flares that I mentioned earlier. This is 78 inches wide versus 76 inches wide on the Ineos, but you notice that the Ineos is very, very slab-sided, and that's why on the inside, it actually feels, and in fact is wider inside than the Land Cruiser. The Land Cruiser has more of a traditional door panel setup where you don't find really thin doors like we find over here. Well, thin's probably not the right word. I mean the distance between the furthest outside bell shape and the furthest inside is narrower than over there. The big difference, of course, that's the roof height. The Grenadier is about 6.5 inches taller than the Land Cruiser. This is actually taller than a Bronco, taller than a Wrangler. Even a lifted Wrangler is probably actually a little closer to the ground in terms of its roof height than this Grenadier. Something I discovered when I tried to park this in the domestic parking garage at San Francisco. It's just too tall. And that could be a problem if you plan on putting roof rails or anything on top of your Grenadier. You'll notice this model has roof rails and it's actually still significantly lower than the Ineos. This, I bought roof rails. I did put them on. I couldn't fit in a regular shopping mall parking garage, so I took them back off, and honestly, I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with them because the height is definitely a big, big feature in the Grenadier. But it's also a bit of a downside because unless you live in an area where the parking garages are all really tall, or you never visit a parking garage, I rarely do, but on occasion it happens, this could be a little bit less practical. At first glance, these two vehicles seem to have quite a bit in common. They're both body-on-frame SUVs, they're both pretty heavy. The Land Cruiser weighs 5,772 pounds, the Grenadier is 5,897 pounds, so both on the chunky side of things. They both have big turning circles. This is 40 feet over here as far as its turning diameter. This one is 44 feet, so the Grenadier, thanks to its longer wheelbase, will definitely take a while to make a circle. Well, because you're probably going to be doing a 3 or 4 or 5 point turn. But after that, there is a great deal of difference. The Land Cruiser comes standard with a hybrid system. It's the same one that's used in the 4Runner and, of course, the Tacoma. It's based around a 2.4-liter 4-cylinder turbo, and it'll give you 326 horsepower combined. Just under 280 horsepower without the single electric motor. Now, that single electric motor is also mated to a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission and a full-time 4-wheel drive system. Over here on the Grenadier, we have a BMW 3-liter inline-6, borrowed out of some of the other BMW products in the US. Under this hood, theoretically, it produces 282 horsepower, although I suspect it's actually a little bit more than that. It's mated to a ZF 8-speed automatic transmission, also borrowed out of the BMW lineup as far as the mating and tuning goes. And then it sends power out through a custom-designed transfer case, full-time four-wheel drive, and front, center, and rear lockers. In the Land Cruiser, we have a center and a rear locker, but no locker up front. Instead, Toyota is relying on their traction management software and the brakes to move power across the front axle. Ineos definitely went in an old school direction, but not just on the traction management, because that's not great on the Ineos. The stability and traction control system, it's a little rough around the edges. But instead, they decided that they wanted to go old school on everything. So instead of ball joints up front, we have kingpins. We have recirculating ball power steering. This has a very different vibe out on the road than this. It also has a really loud power steering rack. We'll get to that probably in just a moment. But the other thing you should know is that it's not terribly efficient. Thanks to its curb weight, its really blunt front end, and its off-road focus, this is EPA rated for 15 miles per gallon versus 23 over here in the Land Cruiser. On the other hand, the Ineos is rated to tow more, 7,716 pounds, likely due to the general frame design, and of course the fact that we get a little bit more power out of just the engine. On this side, it's rated to tow 6,000 pounds. That's a decent amount lower than the Lexus GX, which has the twin-turbo V6. That has actually a really high tow rating. So it's not the frame and structure of the Land Cruiser where the tow limit is. It's really just the drivetrain under this particular hood. If you want to tow more, get the GX, very similar experience with a higher towing capacity and of course more power. One interesting touch with the Grenadier is that you can install the prop rod in two different locations. So if, for instance, like just now, you wanted that hood to be a little bit higher, apparently have to reinstall that the correct direction, you can move the prop rod around, but it's kind of fiddly to get it in its slot. Since both of these vehicles are body-on-frame SUVs, they require a little bit of a hike up to get into the cabin. But the seating position in the Grenadier is much more upright and much higher off the ground, thanks to the higher roofline. According to the numbers, it does not appear that this has that much more headroom than the Land Cruiser, but I would say those numbers are wrong. The big thing to know is that in Europe, you can use different measurements for headroom and legroom, different measurement techniques than we typically see in North America. And sometimes car companies will translate them or retest using the North American normative style, and sometimes they don't. And Ineos apparently did not do that. Also, Polestar's doing that with the Polestar 3. At any rate, we have a completely manual seat design over here. And this seat design, generally speaking, is not my favorite. The Recaro seats lack lumbar support, so I carry my own around because that's a big flaw. If there was one thing about this interior I could change, it would be the front seat back. In the Land Cruiser, we find a pretty typical mainstream front seat. You'll notice that my legs are definitely extended out in front of me, not quite like an old 4Runner, but certainly not as upright as the Grenadier. On the other hand, we have two-way adjustable power lumbar support, a powered seat, powered steering column, 2-position memory over there on the doors, all the things you would assume would come in a car with the price tag like the Grenadier, but don't. The back seats of the Grenadier are definitely a higher climb than the front because they're significantly higher off the ground. This has a really excessive stadium seating vibe inside, and again, more of an upright position where the seat bottom cushion is higher off the ground, and we have more real-world usable legroom, I would say, in here. The legroom figures, again, a little bit difficult to decipher because it would appear that this has significantly less room than in the Land Cruiser, but in this, I could very easily fit a rear-facing child seat with me comfortably driving the vehicle. It is a little bit trickier in the Land Cruiser. Now here, we have a bigger hump and a more pronounced center console in the middle of this, but check out the headroom. Gobs and gobs of headroom. Even though the Land Cruiser is already doing really well on that front, this does even better. Apparently I have a hammer and tools down there in that floorboard, so sorry about that clanking. But over here you can see lots and lots of headroom. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. I still have a little bit of room left. The rear seats, oddly enough, I find a little bit more comfortable than the front seats. They move in a very traditional fashion where you can fold this seat back or down like that, but if you really want to maximize the space, you have to flip and fold this around in this way, and you'll notice you have to manually take out the headrest. So that's kind of a bummer in the back. It's not an automated process like it is in most new SUVs. And things like seatbelt buckles, they do tend to get a little lost down there. The Land Cruiser is definitely going to be easier for kids or people with mobility issues to get in and out of the back because the floorboards are lower and the seat bottom cushion is lower. By my estimation, maybe about 4 or 5 inches lower than in the Grenadier. The rear seating position is also a bit more relaxed and more reclined. Of course, these are adjustable, but in a more natural, comfortable position, I'd say it's probably about here. We have less thigh support naturally because the seat bottom cushion is lower, but we have a slimmer center console, a little bit less of an intrusion there. Legroom, that's not quite as good if you really want to maximize front legroom. This front seat's all the way back in its tracks. And you can see I have very little room left. Both of these SUVs have big square cargo areas. In the Land Cruiser, you can see that it is impacted by the hybrid battery. That's why we have that latch down there and then the cargo floor above that. If you were to buy this in markets where it doesn't come with the hybrid system standard, you'd have an available third row in the back, which is why in this cargo area, we have cup holders, USB-C charge ports, grab handles up on the ceiling, and air vents. I am kind of surprised that Toyota didn't delete those and somehow reclaim some of that cargo area in the back. Over in the Grenadier, it's much more of an industrial vibe, and that really goes for just about everything about this interior. The seat backs have hard plastic covers on them. If I look under this floor mat, you'll notice that we have vinyl floors, and that's because you can hose out the interior of certain versions of the Grenadier. We have that same locking mechanism down there on the rails, and we have a wider and taller opening when it comes to the cargo area. In Europe, they generally don't talk about cargo figures, or they don't include the area above the rear seat back in the cargo volume measurement. So you can actually stick bigger items in the back of this than you can in the Land Cruiser, even though according to the cargo area figures, the cargo area in that Land Cruiser is a bit bigger. Now, again, on the downside, we have this double barn door arrangement, which does mean you have to close the doors in the right order. We have a little bit of a rubber protector here, if I reopen this door, to kind of bounce things off if you do close them in the wrong order, but I have already seen some Grenadiers in the wild with a dent over here on this side because, you know, they just were a little bit too aggressive. This will latch in place, by the way, so you can actually have one open without the other if you want to for some reason. If you want to know everything there is to know about the interior in each of these vehicles, be sure and check out the full reviews. Let's just take a quick overview of the interior. Over here on the Grenadier, you can see we have the optional package, which includes the brown wheel and that brown grip over there on the passenger side, along with the brown handbrake grip there. But the theme in here is definitely industrial and modern. We have those Recaro seats, manual of course, and we have just about every switch and knob that other manufacturers have deleted relocated to this interior. We have a control knob for the infotainment system, a BMW shifter, manual shift for the transfer case, and just tons and tons of aircraft style buttons all along the center console there. Climate control, defroster, defogger, auto start, stop, enable, disable, big air vents there. We have the optional altimeter and compass there in the middle. Touchscreen infotainment system combined with the instrument cluster. Not the biggest fan of that. I kind of wish it had an actual instrument cluster over here, at least a small one. But you know what? I have gotten used to this, and it does offer Apple CarPlay. Up here, we have even more switches because I have the optional auxiliary switch bank there. So just gobs and gobs of switches everywhere. And then we have the manual opening dual moonroof thing. That is the Safari window setup, but no shades come from the factory. So I have some aftermarket shades in there. You can really see how high the ceiling is in the back. Those little hook holes, that's so that way you can have cargo dividers or other things, nets, things like that around. And from this angle, you should really be able to see just how high off the ground those second row seats are. As I said, definitely a very stadium seating vibe. Over in the Land Cruiser, traditional is definitely not the best way to describe this, but I would say maybe more normal modern car experience. We have chestnut brown leather seats. Again, those are power adjustable. More soft touch materials and just better attention to detail as far as build quality goes on the doors, on the dashboard, etc. The software is Toyota's latest version of modern. Not my favorite infotainment system available in a new car, but definitely more fully featured than what we find in the Ineos. We have a lot of buttons as well. This one has tri-zone automatic climate control instead of the single zone semi-automatic system that we find in the Grenadier. Grenadier's climate control, it's not the greatest. We have more electronic controls for the all-wheel drive system or four-wheel drive system, whatever you want to call it. Rear and center lockers. And then we have a lot of different modes over here because we have the latest in off-road systems from Toyota. Crawl control, the DAC, multi-terrain select, the drive mode, etc. Lots of buttons and switches on the steering wheel, a separate instrument cluster, a head-up display, all that's going on there. And Importantly, adaptive cruise control, something that we don't find in the Grenadier. And although JBL is not my favorite factory audio system, I have to admit it's definitely better than what we find in the Grenadier. There may be some common elements in the design of these two vehicles, but out on the road they're very different. The Grenadier has that solid BMW inline-six sound. You also get a little bit of that turbocharger blow-off whistle if you have the safari roof or the windows open, etc. This is also a little faster than I had expected. 0 to 60 in this model, 7.4 seconds. Now, one word of warning, we did retest both of these vehicles this morning, 0 to 60 and 60 to 0, so that way we would have very consistent numbers and really comparable numbers. Acceleration, though, is not just good because of the engine, but also because of the transmission. This, of course, has the ZF 8-speed automatic that we find in so many luxury and high-performance vehicles out there, and it really is a fantastic transmission. The shifts are smooth, they're really crisp, and they're really quick as well. Let's just say that stopping should be planned in advance. It took this model 134 feet to go from 60 back to 0. That's not just because this is heavier, but I think because the brakes are maybe a little bit smaller on this model, and the tire compound obviously has a big deal, or a lot rather, to do with the 60 to 0 stopping distance. If you expected the Land Cruiser to be quicker 0 to 60, well, so did we, but this model was actually a little bit slower than the Grenadier, 7.8 seconds 0 to 60, and I was surprised by that. I'm not quite clear why, but it likely has to do with the hybrid system. Obviously, the state of charge and whether the engine is already on or off is going to affect your 0 to 60 time, but that was with the engine on. If the engine was off, then it was actually about 0.2 of a second slower. You can fix that, of course, by just putting your foot on the accelerator pedal and starting the engine. But beyond the 0 to 60 time, you'll notice that this 2.4 liter turbo is also a bit gruffer. I'll stop again so you can hear this from a start. It definitely has that classic 4-cylinder gruffness to it, but we have less sound insulation between that engine and the passenger compartment than in some 4-cylinder vehicles, like say a Grand Cherokee 4xe or something along those lines. Any way you slice it, the Grenadier sounds a bit better going 0 to 60. It's also going to be smoother, as I said. This 8-speed automatic transmission, I think at its core, is almost as smooth and as quick shifting as that ZF 8-speed, but the hybrid system operation does leave a little bit to be desired. Because of its general design, this hybrid system is never going to be as smooth as the one that we find in a Toyota Camry, because we have that single electric motor, a clutch, and then of course the engine. Just the way things engage and disengage is not going to be as smooth as the permanently connected engine and motor arrangement in that planetary power split system. But they have done a decent amount of work and a decent job at sort of knocking the rough edges off of this system. The first time I drove it at the Tundra launch event, I wasn't that big of a fan, and they have been working on the software and smoothing it out. The software refinements are really obvious when it comes to braking, because the regenerative braking system just wasn't as smooth in transitions between regen and friction braking as it was before. But stopping distance is pretty good, 120 feet in this 4Runner. The Grenadier is not terrible to drive, but it's also not an on-road focused vehicle. It's not designed to be a canyon carver. That's not what this was built for. Whether we're talking about the solid axle, the extreme travel that we have in the front suspension, the kingpins, the recirculating ball steering, etc., 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 this was just not designed for the things that the Land Cruiser was designed for, which is more of a middle-of-the-road balance between worlds. There's a reason that we don't have a lot of steering feel, because if you are off-roading, if you are going through the mud and you hit a rock, or if you're on a road like this every single day for hours at a time, then this is simply going to be more comfortable. You'll notice that this road's really rough. In this same section in the Land Cruiser, the steering wheel was jerking around. This, you can steer with your pinky. That's part of why it doesn't return to center and why it just has that very unusual steering feel that so many people complain about, because they wanted you to be able to do this. If this had a more typical suspension and a rack and pinion steering rack, it definitely wouldn't be the same. Ride quality in the Grenadier is certainly not the softest out there, but it's definitely more comfortable than the Land Cruiser if we're talking about rougher road surfaces like this. And that all has to do with the softer springs, we have more suspension travel, we have a bit more cushion on these tires, etc. This was just more designed for this kind of daily duty than the Land Cruiser was, which is again a little bit more of a balance between worlds. When we're talking about cabin noise, there's not too much of a difference at 50 miles an hour. In here I measured 73 decibels, so certainly a little bit louder than the Land Cruiser, but there's more of a difference going on. This is significantly more tiring to my ears on a longer journey because the entire inside of this acts like a drum. If you ever wondered what it was like to drive around inside a drum with wheels, you might want to drive a Grenadier for a while because the square surfaces in the back just act like sounding boards. I'm not sure whether it's the side or whether it's the floor or the roof. We have tried a little bit of Dynamat in the back and that did not seem to help it. Any way you slice it, there's just more road noise, more road rumble, especially those low frequencies coming through into this cabin. So if you're doing a longer journey in the Grenadier, you might want to pack your earplugs. The 4Runner is definitely the sharper handling vehicle in this pair. Not to say that the 4Runner is a canyon carver exactly, but the steering feels pretty normal. The body control is well done. It does lean in the corners, but not excessively so. We have a stabilizer disconnect bar to give you that extra suspension travel up front that you might want when off-roading, but when on-roading it's connected to give you better control. And it is really obvious. This doesn't actually weigh that much less than the Grenadier, but it definitely feels more nimble out on this road surface. It's easier to drive harder on your daily commute. Now, it still has a solid axle in the back, but this is a really well done suspension in the rear and in the front. Back in the 4Runner, again, we definitely hear a lot of that 2.4 liter engine in the cabin, but when it's not revving up, we measured 72 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. Bearing in mind that the Grenadier is definitely a bigger, taller box than the Land Cruiser, its fuel economy is actually surprising. We have been averaging about 18 miles per gallon over the last 6,200 miles in this model, so it's definitely a solidly efficient vehicle given its general design parameters. Not as efficient as the Land Cruiser, of course, because of its hybrid system, but thanks to the BMW engine, this is surprisingly good. Again, not as efficient as the Land Cruiser, but given what it is, with the solid axles, this really blunt front end, the very upright windshield, and this extremely tall roof, I actually have to admit, I've been overall pretty impressed with the fuel efficiency over the last 6,200 miles. If I've made it sound like driving the Grenadier is terrible, well, that's not exactly what I'm saying. It's not as fun as a whole lot of vehicles I could mention, but there's something about the personality of the Grenadier that is enchanting and enthralling in a completely irrational way. In every way that matters, the Land Cruiser is simply better to drive on-road. Yes, this is better to drive off-road, but I don't drive off-road that much. Yes, I drive on poorly paved roads. I drive on gravel roads and dirt roads on a very regular basis. I have to drive a 2-mile gravel road to get to my house and away from my house every single day, but you don't need a Grenadier for that. But there's just something about the nature of this that is attractive. I find myself driving significantly slower in the Grenadier, just sort of enjoying the scenery. Admittedly, driving the Grenadier requires more attention and more dedication than other vehicles. You have to steer it to the left and then you have to steer it back to the right because it doesn't self-center. Yes, it's going to be louder. Yes, it's going to be less efficient, but it puts a smile on your face in a way that, you know, maybe it's because I'm crazy. Let me know, obviously, yes, I am, but there's something about the personality that you just don't see in other vehicles. Most vehicles are so similar out there these days that something that breaks the mold, something that is different either accidentally or deliberately or whatever, just really stands out. And that's perhaps what I appreciate the most about this. So what do each of these vehicles have going for them? Well, the Land Cruiser definitely has the price tag. It starts at $56,700 plus destination versus $75,100 for the Grenadier over there. It also, of course, has Toyota's reputation for dependability and reliability. How much will that apply to a hybrid 4-cylinder turbocharged Land Cruiser? That remains to be seen, but if I were a betting man, I would bet on Toyota before I bet on the Upstart. It's also a little bit more comfortable on-road. It's better to drive, just generally speaking, has better fuel economy, a quieter cabin, all the sort of creature comforts that you'd expect in a modern brand new vehicle. And some practical touches too, like the onboard 2.4 kilowatt inverter. I have to admit, an onboard inverter is something I would love to see over there in the Grenadier. The Ineos, on the other hand, it's just quirky, and that's its big selling point. But the boxiness is not just a visual feature, it's also very practical. It's got a lot of room inside, surprising amount of room really in that cargo area. It's also bonkers capable. Locking front differential, solid axles, kingpins in the front. If I were to need to take a vehicle across a big desert or across a mud bog, if I were to be in Alaska and I had spare parts, mind you, but I wanted a vehicle that was as durable as possible. It would be the Grenadier. Just the general design of the suspension, the undercarriage, etc. Everything in that vehicle is bonkers overbuilt, and that is truly its mission. The no-frills design, that could attract some folks, the ability to easily clean out the interior, the drain holes in the structure, the vinyl floors, etc. All that is definitely a feature for some. It tows very well, and it does tow notably more than the Land Cruiser over here. It's also a little bit quicker, a little bit quirkier. It's designed to impress, it's rarer. All of that is definitely a feature for the Grenadier. When it comes to the downsides, there really aren't too many on the Land Cruiser. I do have a wish list, of course. I wish the cargo area was a bit more practical. I wish they deleted some of those third row things. I wish the hybrid system was a bit smoother, a little bit less gruff as far as the engine note goes, etc. But this is a really solid vehicle. It's sort of the Swiss Army knife of SUVs. Very capable, very comfortable on the inside. Sure, it's not as comfortable as some, but this does everything really quite well. The Grenadier, on the other hand, that's a more complicated story, because this is probably not the most eloquent way to say it, but when it comes to the way that the Grenadier drives, it's not great, let's be frank. It's probably the worst driving vehicle that I have driven in quite some time that's not a cargo van or a cutaway or some sort of ridiculously big commercial vehicle. But that's because the Grenadier was designed to do things that the Land Cruiser can only dream of, and that's why it has the front suspension and the steering that it does. That's why the Grenadier is the way that it is. And if it didn't have that, it just wouldn't be quirky and interesting and so uniquely focused at the kind of off-roading that it's capable of. Now, clearly, if you want to do Moab and you want a tight course capable vehicle, you're going to want something smaller and lighter. Also with solid axles, you're probably going to want a two-door Wrangler. That's not what this is. This was designed with country living in the UK in mind, and that's probably not too far off where I am, except for, the redwood trees hanging out back there. This is a single-purpose instrument. This is a sword, and you would never want to take a pocket knife to a sword fight, but how often do you find yourself at a sword fight? My guess would be possibly never. And that's why, as far as which vehicle is better, clearly that's going to have to be the Land Cruiser. Which one would I be more interested in living with? Well, I think my 14 months with the Grenadier probably have spoken a little too loudly there, because I hadn't planned on keeping it. Now I don't know exactly what the future will hold. I mean, child seats fit the back, so win on that front. Practicality, fuel efficiency, long-term dependability, reliability, all unknowns with this. Big thing to know though, service network. The closest Ineos dealer to me, which currently you must visit if you want to reset the super duper annoying maintenance reminder on the instrument cluster, is about 2.5 hours from my house. Now that is closer than the second closest, which is about 5 hours away in Pasadena. But the service network is not enormous with Ineos, and there are those additional quirks. No adaptive cruise control, no blind spot monitoring. Some of the active safety systems are just quirky and bad, like the autonomous emergency braking, not the best ever. It doesn't have that latest suite of active safety tech that you might expect in a modern EV. But again, that's kind of why it's kind of quirky and cool. Last problem, it also is shockingly expensive for what you get. Not G-Wagon expensive, mind you. It could be seen as a discount G-Wagon, but certainly more Lexus than Toyota. You could definitely get yourself a really nicely equipped Lexus GX for the price of a fully loaded Grenadier, and those fully loaded Grenadier models are almost knocking on the Lexus LX's door. Let me know what you think about all that, and be sure and check out the full videos on either of these. You'll find those on the channel. See all of you later.